The first time Seu James knew he was onto something, he didn't even have a soil test kit. He just noticed that the patch of soil under his oak tree where he'd dumped the cold fireplace ashes 3 winters ago grew tomatoes twice as tall as the ones in the sun. He didn't know why. He just knew the feeling of holding a fat, heavy fruit in his hand while the neighbor's plants still had green flowers. That was 40 years ago, and he's never stopped mixing ash with water ever since. The thing is, the botany textbooks all say the same warning. Don't do it. Don't mix ash with rainwater. The RHS manual from 2014 even calls it a common error that leaches potassium away and leaves an alkaline crust that burns roots. Seu James had never read the RHS manual. He read the soil, and the soil kept telling him something the books refused to print. So when the old gardener soaked 5 pounds of white, sifted wood ash in a 50-gallon rain barrel, let it sit for 4 days, and then poured exactly 1 cup of that murky liquid around the base of each tomato plant after flowering, he expected to see a change. He didn't expect what happened next. Within 2 weeks, the leaves on his Roma tomatoes turned a green so dark and dense they looked almost black. The stems thickened. The fruit set came so heavy that he had to stake each plant twice. A visiting botanist from the local university extension program saw the plot, knelt down, and scooped a handful of the soil. She smelled it. She touched it. She said, "What did you do to this soil?"
Watched a 70-year-old gardener prove the textbooks wrong.
You just watched a 70-year-old gardener prove the textbooks wrong with nothing but ash and rainwater. That kind of alchemy doesn't come from luck. It comes from digging deeper. Subscribe to uncover more of the secrets the experts forgot. And tell me in the comments.
When was the first time you suspected the official advice wasn't the whole truth?
Here's where the official story cracks open. The university data from ESALC in 2019 shows that dry wood ash, when kept dry, can raise soil pH by a controlled 0.3 to 0.5 points in a single application, releasing potassium and calcium in forms that roots can absorb immediately. But the RHS warning is also true. If you leave that same ash exposed to rain, the potassium leaches out in hours, and what remains is a crust of insoluble calcium carbonate that sits on the surface like a white scab. So, how did Seu James get the opposite result? The answer is the difference between dumping ash on the soil and brewing ash into a solution. When he collected ash from his wood stove, he didn't just dump it into a rain barrel. He sifted it first through a fine mesh strainer to remove charcoal chunks, nails, and unburned wood. Then he stored the powder in a sealed metal trash can under the porch, bone dry. When the rain barrel was full after a spring storm, he added exactly 5 pounds of that sifted ash to 50 gallons of collected rainwater. Then he covered the barrel and let it steep for 96 hours, stirring once each morning. Here's what happens chemically during those 4 days. The potassium carbonate in the ash dissolves into the water first. Within the first 12 hours, it converts into potassium hydroxide, which raises the pH of the water itself to about 10.5. That's too alkaline to apply directly. It would burn the roots like bleach. But Seu James didn't apply it on day 1. By day 3, the calcium carbonate in the ash begins to buffer the solution. The pH drops back to around 7.8. The potassium remains in solution, but it's now bound to bicarbonate ions, a form that plant roots can absorb without stress. The phosphate fraction, roughly 5 to 10% of the ash by weight, stays suspended as fine particles that settle slowly into a nutrient-rich sediment at the bottom of the barrel. 4 days of steeping, 1 cup of liquid, and the chemistry flips from toxic to life-giving. That's the difference between a failed experiment and a harvest that leaves the neighbors speechless. Subscribe so you don't lose this formula. I'll keep testing every variable for you. Now drop a comment. Have you ever brewed a soil amendment before? What was the result? On day 4, Seu James poured off the liquid into a clean watering can, leaving the sediment untouched. He applied 1 cup around each plant directly to the root zone, not on the leaves. Then he watered it in with another cup of plain rainwater to push the solution down to the feeder roots and wash any residual alkali off the soil surface. If the way that alkaline crust on your own garden soil feels familiar, stay with me. This is where the real trick starts. The mistake most people make is the same mistake the agronomists warn about. They spread dry ash on the soil surface and then water it in from above. The water leaches the potassium out of the ash before it ever reaches the root zone, and the calcium carbonate remains on the surface, forming that white, impermeable crust that sheds water instead of absorbing it. You've seen it. The powdery white film that forms after a rain shower, the way water beads up and runs off instead of soaking in. That's not the ash feeding the soil. That's the ash blocking the soil. Seu James's method avoids that entirely because the potassium is already dissolved in the water when it hits the root zone. The calcium stays suspended in the liquid instead of crusting on the surface. The plant gets both nutrients simultaneously in a form that the ESALC study calls immediate bioavailability, meaning the roots start absorbing within hours, not weeks. But here's the trap. If you use the wrong kind of ash, the whole process turns toxic. Human cremated ash, for example, has a pH of roughly 11.8, comparable to household bleach. The sodium levels are 2,000 times higher than what any plant can tolerate. Mix that with rainwater, and you create a saline solution that pulls water out of the root cells through osmosis, effectively dehydrating the plant from the roots up. The leaves wilt. The stems soften. The soil turns into a sterile, alkaline paste that nothing will grow in for years. Some people hear this and think it's too much work. You're not that person. You already know the difference between waiting months for a slow fertilizer to break down and watching your tomatoes double in size within 2 weeks. You're still reading. That means you're the gardener who doesn't quit when the first try doesn't spark an explosion. The ones who quit are already gone. You're the one who will actually brew this tea tomorrow morning. Subscribe so you stay ahead of every soil secret I uncover. And in the comments, tell me one piece of gardening advice you ignored that ended up being the best thing you ever did for your plants. Seu James also knew another trick that the books don't teach. He matched the ash tea to the plant's growth stage. Before flowering, he used only plain rainwater. The high potassium in ash tea during early growth can force the plant to put energy into stems and leaves at the expense of root development. He waited until the first yellow flower appeared. Then he applied the tea. The potassium signaled the plant to shift from leaf production to fruit production, and the calcium in the tea prevented blossom end rot. That black, sunken rot on the bottom of tomatoes that ruins a whole harvest. The result wasn't just bigger fruit. The harvest window extended by nearly 3 weeks. The same plants that usually produced fruit for 5 weeks kept producing for 8 weeks. The botanist who visited his plot measured the soil pH at 6.7, nearly neutral, ideal for tomatoes. The untreated soil 20 feet away measured 5.9. The ash tea had corrected the pH without a chemical amendment, without bagged lime, without a single trip to the garden center. At what point in this video did you realize you've been handling ash wrong your whole life? Write it in the comments. I need to know how many of us were taught the same mistake. There's one more detail that separates Seu James from the weekend gardener. He never used ash from pressure-treated wood, painted wood, or wood that had been used in a barbecue where lighter fluid or charcoal briquettes had burned. Those contained heavy metals, arsenic, chromium, copper, that concentrate in the ash and get absorbed by the plant. The SETSB report from 2008 showed that ash from treated lumber contains arsenic levels up to 50 times the safe limit for food crops. Seu James only used ash from clean, untreated hardwood, oak and hickory from his own woodlot, burned hot and fast in a wood stove, not smoldered in an open fire pit. The difference between white, fluffy ash and gray, gritty ash is the difference between a nutrient and a contaminant. White ash indicates complete combustion with high potassium content. Gray ash means unburned carbon and lower nutrient value. He also rotated his ash tea applications, never more than once every 3 weeks, never more than 1 cup per plant.
20
the
pounds
Fairfax
per
County
1,000 square
Extension
feet.
Service
That's
recommends
more
a
than I thought.
maximum of 20 pounds of wood ash per 1,000 square feet per year. That's roughly 1 5-gallon bucket for an entire garden. Exceeding that raises soil pH above 7.5, locking up phosphorus and iron and turning leaves yellow with chlorosis. But Seu James didn't follow the Extension Service's exact numbers. He found his own threshold by testing. He'd apply the tea to one plant, mark it with a red string, and leave the next plant untreated. He watched. He measured leaf color with his eyes, stem thickness with his fingers, fruit weight with his hands. After 3 seasons, he knew the exact concentration his soil needed. Now imagine your tomato plants 3 weeks from now, standing tall under the humid morning sun, the dark green leaves catching the light, the stems stiff and thick under your fingertips, the first heavy fruit already tugging the branch down. The ash tea you brewed 4 days ago is already feeding the soil microbes that will feed your plant next week. Here's where most people quit. They try the ash tea once, don't see instant results after a single day, and go back to the synthetic bag. But Seu James learned something from his 40 years of trial and error that no botany textbook can teach you. The soil doesn't change overnight. It changed day by day, root hair by root hair, until one morning you walk out with your coffee cup and realize the plant is taller than it was yesterday. Now that you know what the old gardener figured out while the experts were still writing warnings, look at your own tomato plant with the yellowing lower leaves. Tomorrow morning, before the sun climbs high, sift the ash from your clean wood stove into a bucket of collected rainwater. Cover it, wait 4 days, and pour 1 cup around the base. Then come back next week and tell me what the neighbors said when they saw your garden. The secret of the 70-year-old gardener isn't magic. It's the patience to let the water work the chemistry for you. Subscribe and come harvest with us. In the next video, we're going deeper into what happens when you combine that ash tea with crushed eggshells and the specific coffee grounds from your morning filter. The result will change how you feed your garden forever.